This is episode 9 of That Shakespeare Life.
As amazing as it might seem, to think that these important women in Shakespeare's life and in the life of Shakespeare were illiterate, there is some evidence to suggest that they did not learn to read.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
William Shakespeare had 3 children before he was famous in London. And these 3 children formed a major part of his life throughout his life. He's constantly going back to Stratford to visit them, sending money back from his profits in London, and then retiring there to his family home and being active in the lives of his wife and children after he finishes his work in London. But just like William Shakespeare, there's not much that we know about his family. But today, Grace Tiffany, who is an author and recently wrote her first novel about the fictional life of Judith Quiney, she joins us today to discuss her research and what she was able to find out about the youngest daughter of William Shakespeare. Hello and welcome to That Shakespeare Life. I am Cassidy Cash, and this week we're going to be talking with Grace Tiffany. Grace is a successful novelist, author, and professor of Shakespeare at Western Michigan University. Her first novel, My Father Had a Daughter, was published in 2003 and is a fictional tale about the life of Shakespeare's second daughter, Judith. While fictional, the book brings the historical facts about Judith Quiney to life on the pages of her book. Since her debut novel, Grace has completed 6 historical novels set in the Renaissance or Middle Ages, and her work focuses primarily on Shakespeare. Her latest book, Gunpowder Percy, builds on the historical facts surrounding the 1605 Gunpowder Plot, when Shakespeare was 41 years old. In addition to her novels, Grace has received numerous research and teaching awards for her creativity in the field of Shakespeare Studies. She has written numerous scholarly articles and monographs on Renaissance history and culture, with her work appearing in Shakespeare Studies, Texas Studies in Literature and Language, and the Renaissance Quarterly, among others. James Shapiro, the celebrated Shakespearean author and one of the foremost Shakespeareans of our time, has called Grace's book, The Turquoise Ring, one of the 6 best creative adaptations of Shakespeare in history. Today, Grace is joining us to discuss the subject of her first novel, Judith Quiney, and take us inside the life of Shakespeare's second daughter. Grace, welcome. It's an honor to speak with you today.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I think we should clarify up front that your book, My Father Had a Daughter, while based on the real life of Judith Quiney and a celebrated telling at that, it's not actually intended as an autobiography. It is, by point of fact, a work of fiction. Is that correct?
Yes, it's not a biography. It's fiction, and it's probably good for you to point that out at the outset.
Well, I imagine, though, that writing a historical novel on Judith Quiney required a great deal of research. And I was wondering if you could tell us about your research process and how you got to know Judith.
Well, I didn't do a lot of primary research because there's been so much research into Shakespeare's life and family, and there's many, many biographies out there. And I mean, the sort of primary research I did, I took a trip and I did kind of like architectural research, went to Stratford, looked at the Shakespeare birthplace, looked at the sites of his properties. And so I did, some sort of primary material culture research relative to the time period in order to create a realistic setting and sort of understand what I was describing. As far as for the life of Judith as an individual, there's as much written about her as is known by a variety of biographers. And so I took these kind of skeletal facts that they have about her life. I mean, there isn't a tremendous amount known about her, but they know when she was born, they know when she died, they know how many children she had and whom she married. Those facts are so readily available. I took those and then just used those as a scaffold on which to build a character, and made a bunch of stuff up because, as we said, it's fiction. But the stuff that I made up was built on the stuff that's true, that we do know, and it doesn't contradict or conflict with what the facts are. It just embellishes them.
So that, to me, sounds like a really fun way to write a novel. And I know when it comes to Judith, though, as you've mentioned, there's not a lot that we do know. I think what I know is that she was Shakespeare's second daughter, and she was the second twin there with Hamnet, who is kind of famous, I guess, for various reasons. But what can you tell us as far as a brief overview or even kind of an introduction to who Judith Quiney was?
She was one of three children that Shakespeare had with Anne Hathaway. She and her twin brother were several years, 2 or 3 years younger than her older sister, Susanna. She and Hamnet, her brother, were named after family friends and were born when Shakespeare was quite young. He was a pretty young dad, so he was about 21 years old when the twins were born. And she sadly lost her brother. Shakespeare lost his son, Judith's twin, when he was 11 years old or so in the mid-1590s, that would have been. And so we don't really know, we don't have, her account of what happened. We don't even know how he died. We don't know her reaction to that, but it can be assumed that, it was traumatic for her. And that's part of why I wanted to write about her, is that I thought that that was an interesting situation to have had a twin, to have lost a twin, and particularly when you have a dad who seems to be interested in putting twins into his plays, so that you have a famous pair of twins in Twelfth Night, and you have a pair of twins in The Comedy of Errors. So twins are interesting. So she was a twin who really grew up, at least entered adolescence, without her twin. We know that she married when she was 31, which was a little bit old for the time period. For her sort of middle class, marrying in your late 20s was not that unusual, but she's a little bit old. But she married, she did have children. She married the local vintner, who was a wine seller. His name was Thomas Quiney. We know a few things about her marriage. She lived in Stratford her whole life. We don't know whether she traveled anywhere else. We don't have any primary material from her. We don't know if she was literate or not. In fact, beyond these facts of marriage, birth, baptism, marriage, childbirth, there's not a lot of information. We know certain things about how Shakespeare's provision for her in his will, but that's not that unusual. I mean, there's no reason that we wouldn't know a lot about. We don't know much about anybody. We don't even know that much more about Shakespeare. But not knowing a lot, not knowing more than bare facts like that, kind of legal facts, is good for a historical novelist, because then you get to fill in gaps, and you don't have to tell lies. You just have to sort of speculate and make interesting suppositions, and you can weave a character on top of all of that.
It's like the alternate ending in a movie or something. I decide I wanted to go this way, so you get to paint it that way.
Yeah, and in fact, I even have done that where, having written this novel about her, and I later wrote a screenplay, and the screenplay has a different ending. A screenplay based on the novel, but the screenplay has a different ending than the novel. And I'm sure the true ending was something entirely different than that. But like we said, it's works of imagination.
Exactly, and that's the heart of art, as it were. So that's exciting. So, you may not know this then, or history may not know from the lack of details we have, but can you tell us about whether or not she had an occupation? I mean, was she involved in theater like her father?
There's no reason to think so. There's no record of that being the case. And like I said, there's really no information about whether or where. She traveled in her life outside of Stratford-on-Avon, which is this Midlands sort of market town that the family lived in. I assume, and I hope she was interested in this thing that her father was so celebrated for. But we just don't have, as you know, and as it's sort of famously known, we don't have enough information even about Shakespeare himself and his own attitude toward his life. And that's why people kind of speculate and make up a lot of stuff about who Shakespeare might have been. But we know even less about his family and how they regarded his occupation. We know he never abandoned them, and he lived this kind of two sort of parallel lives for at least throughout his professional life of living in London and then coming back and living in Stratford. But he sent them money and he made them rich, and then he went back and retired in Stratford, and he left his daughter's money in his will. And, I like to assume that he included them in his life, at least in conversation, and that they became familiar with and interested in who he was as a poet. But there's not a lot of evidence that she ever even traveled to London to see one of his plays. I'd like to think she did, but we can't know that.
So we know that he was attentive to his family at least, but we can't really know what her relationship was like with him or whether she was close to him or anything like that.
We can't, although what people tend to do, and even the best biographers of Shakespeare have trouble resisting doing this, we have in his plays so much about family life, so many representations of families, so many representations of fathers and daughters, and very, very frequently a father with two daughters. And that's not an original comic tradition. It's usually comedy that he does this in. That's not original with Shakespeare. That was fairly conventional for a romantic comedy to dramatize relationships between fathers and daughters trying to defy their fathers and marry somebody that their father didn't want to marry. But it's sort of irresistible for biographers who know that Shakespeare had two daughters to look at that interest that he had in putting these father-daughter scenarios into his plays, and then to read into that fact a lot of sort of speculation about how he was with his daughter. So, I think that's probably not a valid way to do biography, but we can see, and I think we can assume, that his experience of being a dad to daughters and various issues that come up, particularly with adolescent daughters, that they found a way into his plays, and that he thought about that when writing all of the wonderful dialogue that he wrote between fathers and daughters. And there's so many plays, The Taming of the Shrew and The Merchant of Venice and A Midsummer Night's Dream.
It's certainly
so that's what we have.
Yeah.
Instead of biography, we have works of the literary imagination, which you interpret biographically at your peril, because imagination is imagination. It always is based on one's experience of life. It's based on the writer's experience of life, but we don't know in what way it's based on the writer's experience of life.
Exactly, which is the classic, intentional fallacy idea.
Exactly. Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
Well, I wanted to ask you about, you're talking about Shakespeare's relationship with his daughters and how we have these little bits of evidence. And there's something in Judith's life that some historians have actually labeled with this title of the Quiney scandal. And apparently what went down caused Shakespeare to change his will. And I was wondering if you could tell us what happened.
That episode, it was one that occurred in connection with her marriage to Thomas Quiney, that the pair of them were married, and I'm not sure whether this came to light just before their marriage or just after. I think it was just after, but I'm not sure, that it was revealed or he was charged with having fathered a child with another woman, and he went through a public sort of church. It was a church process of expiation and shaming. He went to something that was known as, or probably casually known as, the bawdy court, the BAWDY, where these sorts of offenses, carnal offenses, are punished and are punished by the church. And so I think he had to pay a fine, or I'm not sure what the consequences were, but it's fairly clear, that it was a scandal and an embarrassment to the Shakespeare family, who had just married their daughter to Thomas Quiney.
Because he was kind of well established in theory. Wasn't he a doctor or something?
That was Susanna Shakespeare's
That was
husband.
Susanna's husband. Okay.
Thomas Quiney was a vintner. It didn't have quite as dignified a profession. He was the wine seller. There are suggestions that he was a little bit of a shady wine seller, that he used to water the wine and whatnot, But he was a middle class businessman, and he came from a family that, as I said, were friends with the Shakespeares and established in the community. As far as Shakespeare's reaction to that, he altered his will shortly after Quiney was found guilty of these charges of immorality and of, I don't know if it was technically adultery, because I think it happened before he married Judith, but it was still immorality by the terms of the day. And Shakespeare did something to his will which altered the amount of money that was settled as dowry, I think, on Quiney. What he did was to sort of to substitute his daughter's name for his son-in-law's name in the money that he was settling on her. And the intent seems to have been, to sort of keep money more under her control, or under the Shakespeare family's control, rather than his, and showing a little bit of a distrust for his son-in-law. That's as much as we know. I mean, the two remained married, as people tended to do, and she outlived her husband by quite a bit. And actually, Shakespeare died not too long after that, so we don't know what kind of future relations with his son-in-law he would have maintained. But it apparently was not a match made in heaven.
Yes, or at least one that seems strained on a couple of fronts there.
Yes.
In an effort to get to know Judith a little bit better, can you tell us about her resistance to Protestantism? Now, forgive me if I am again confusing her with Susanna, because I know that one of Shakespeare's daughters kind of broke from the rest of the family in their defending their own right to practice Catholicism. Was that Judith, or was that Susanna?
I think if it was either of them, it was Susanna. I have heard something about that with regard to Susanna.
Okay.
And I can't remember that. Yeah, what information that's based on, but there's not a lot of evidence that suggests that Judith was any kind of a religious rebel in any way. So she was married in the Church of England, and I mean, there's a lot been said in recent years. There's a sort of interest in speculating that Shakespeare was Catholic, that his family was Catholic. There's not much evidence to support that idea. There's a whole lot of evidence to support his just conventional mainstream Protestantism. He was a churchgoer. Ceremonies were performed in the church. I'm saying an English churchgoer. England had been Protestant for quite a long time, with this kind of brief 5-year diversion under the reign of Queen Mary in the middle of the 16th century. But by the time Shakespeare was born, England was pretty decisively a Protestant nation. And there were an awful lot of Catholics in it. But when people point to Shakespeare's family as having had a history of Catholicism, well, actually, everybody had a history of Catholicism if you look back to the beginning of the 16th century, because England was officially a Catholic country until Henry VIII came along and made changes. So it's sort of interesting to present the family as in some way rebellious and nonconformist, but there's not a lot of evidence that supports that.
That's really interesting. So we know kind of where she stood on religion. Do we know whether or not she was well educated? Did she go to school? Did young girls go to school the way, we know William Shakespeare went to grammar school, or we think he went to grammar school. Do we know whether or not Judith attended school?
In general, grammar school was for the boys, and it wasn't that unusual for girls to learn to read if they, had lived in a literate family, but in general, they would learn those things at home. And there's actually reason to think, this has always been amazing to me, but there's reason to think that Judith never did, because a couple of documents they have where she was to sign them, she used a mark instead of signing her name. And that's also the case for her mother, Anne Hathaway. And as amazing as it might seem, to think that these important women in Shakespeare's life and in the life of Shakespeare were illiterate, there is some evidence to suggest that they did not learn to read. I imagine maybe there was a lot of reading out loud that went on in the household, and I hope that's the case. But it was not that unusual for even middle-class women, which is essentially what they were, and fairly wealthy women, by the end of Shakespeare's life, because he made so much money, to still not know how to read and write. So, in my novel, she's quite literate, but that was just something that this is my character, based on Judith, and she may have been, the indication is that she may not have been as well.
That was just my next question for you, actually, was about your book and where did you take the creative license? So you've shown us kind of what you were able to know about Judith, and I'm glad that you made her literate in your book, because you're right, it does seem like a shame for the daughter of someone who's known so much for words to not know how to read. So it's fun to think that she could have been, at least for the pages of your book. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your book and, when you did have to fill in the gaps that you've identified, which ones were maybe your favorite?
Well, the plot that I wanted to create with her, it was necessary that she be a reader, because she's always finding draft pages of plays that her father threw away and, things like that. But I will say, though, that even had she not been, to be illiterate was not necessarily to be wholly uneducated in this time, because there was a lot of, as I said, oral reading. There was a lot of being read to. There was a lot of, you could certainly participate in literature without reading it oneself. And of course, there were a whole lot of domestic arts that women learned to practice. And there's no reason to think that Judith wasn't domestically literate, I guess, if you can put it that way. But in my book, she is kind of a suppressed artist herself, because I was interested in that idea. It made for interesting character, and the plot that I wanted to create, which has her eventually, out of her anger at something that she believes her father has written. She finds some pages of a draft for Twelfth Night, which is one of the plays about twins that I mentioned before. And out of anger at, grief over the death of her twin, anger at the way she thinks her dad is representing that on the stage, she runs off to London herself, and all kinds of crazy things happen there, and she does end up on the stage. No reason in the world to think that actually happened. However, you probably couldn't find something that would flatly rule out the possibility of that ever happening, simply because the data that we have about her life is so sketchy. My novel mostly concerns her adventures in London, or at least the first half of it is. I wrote it quite like 15 years ago, so I don't completely remember. But I know she ends up back in Stratford, and is very much a woman of lively intellect who is trying to come to terms with griefs in her life, chiefly the loss of her brother, and to find some sort of occupation through which she can compensate for the loss of him, which is, I've never, I'm not a twin, so I don't know what it would be like, but, I would imagine that in a certain way it feels like a loss of oneself, or a huge part of oneself. And so she's kind of searching for that in the life of a middle-class woman of Stratford, after having this spectacular episode where she runs off to London and does crazy things down there. But like Shakespeare, she ends up in Stratford at the end and having to come to terms with just the life of a small town community. That's where the book leaves her at the end.
It's certainly an exciting way to get to know this part of Shakespeare history, or at least to explore that. You mentioned earlier that there were some of your favorite biographers or people that wrote biographies of Judith Quiney. And while these book recommendations don't have to be necessarily those, I wondered if you could tell us one or two books you've read that had the biggest impact on you.
With regard to Shakespeare and his family, I've never read a biography of Judith Quiney just in isolation. And I think any sort of truthful biography would have to be pretty short if it was just simply focused on her. But biographies of Shakespeare that I like, there's a pair of biographies, or it's kind of actually a two-part work by Russell Fraser, which is really good because he's a Shakespeare scholar. I mean, he's an English professor who understands the plays very well and understands the world of the London theater, and so is able to talk intelligently about what Shakespeare was doing when he lived in London. So those are called Shakespeare, the Early Years, or Young Shakespeare, I think is the first one, and then there's Shakespeare, the Later Years. I've read, this isn't a biography of Shakespeare, but I do a lot of reading of Andrew Gurr, who is the premier theater historian for the early modern period in England. And so I learned so much about just the relationships between rival theatrical companies in the late 16th and early 17th century and the structures of playhouses. And so those are really good for that. That's more on Shakespeare himself than Shakespeare's daughters. I'd stay away from Stephen Greenblatt, who, I mean, if you're interested in actual biography, because he got a lot of attention for writing a book called Will in the World, which is interesting, but a real hybrid, combination of facts and fantasy and speculation. So it depends on what you're looking for. I mean, apparently it's very, a lot of people like it a lot, but it's not exactly a biography. So that's sort of a kind of a hybrid thing. I mean, I was thinking you should write a biography or write fiction and call it fiction, and not try and intermingle those things because it gets too confusing. Yeah, so that's one kind of warning, and two recommendations: Russell Fraser and Andrew Gurr.
Excellent recommendations. Thank you for those. I wanted to ask you for your best advice for someone that's trying to do something like what you've done here, or researching and writing a historical novel. What is some of your best advice for trying to write fiction around the life of someone who is well known, but who doesn't have that much information to discover?
Well, I always think that it's good to choose someone about whom not a lot is known. I mean, maybe the name is known, but the details of the biography are somewhat sketchy. And I guess I keep thinking of the word skeletal, that you can flesh out the skeleton of mostly external biographical facts, like she lived here, or he, lived here at this time and lived in this house and married this person. And most people, if you're going to go back to the time period in which my novels are set, that's going to be most people, because you don't have diaries and journals, lying around. In the 19th century, it's completely different. So, that would be one thing, to choose somebody in the Renaissance, because farther back you go, the more freedom that you have to embroider, because the sketchier the facts actually are. The other recommendation that I have would be to try to get the language right, to try to make the characters speak in the way that they actually spoke, or a reasonable facsimile thereof. The best way to do that is to read a lot of primary material, of not so much secondary historical books that talk about these characters, these people, but read the kind of things that they read, read texts that are written in the idiom that they themselves used. And you'll hit a wall if you go back before about the year 1600, or let's say 1500, because then you're going to run into, they spoke Middle English back then, and you can't, you're not going to write your novel in Middle English. But I think you can go back as far as the English Renaissance, and you can write a book with people speaking to a certain extent, to a believable extent in the way that they spoke then, and then it helps to create that atmosphere. Language, dialogue, between characters is I think a really important thing in historical fiction to get that right.
So since you completed this book on Judith, you've written 6 historical novels based in this time period, and I'm excited to hear about what's next for you. What are you working on that you're most excited about?
Actually, not writing a novel right now. I've done a work that's partly translation and partly literary criticism of translating some of the poems and stories written by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian author, about Shakespeare, because Borges loved Shakespeare, was fascinated with Shakespeare. And so I've written a book called Borges on Shakespeare, which is going to be published this year. It includes Borges short stories and translations, as well as poems and essays. And I did sneak one of my own short stories in there, which is kind of in honor of Borges, but it was inspired by a wonderful story that Borges wrote about Shakespeare called Everything and Nothing, which is also in the book. So that's what I'm doing now. It's not a novel at all. It's just this kind of weird thing, a weird work of fiction and scholarship and poetry. Most of it not mine, some of it mine. I mean, the scholarship mine, but fiction of Borges mostly, all combined into one.
That sounds exciting. Please do let us know when that becomes available, because if it's as creative as your book on Judith, I know we're going to want to check out that short story that's in there. So thank you very much, Grace Tiffany, for being here and for sharing with us about the life of Judith Quiney. It has been fun talking with you.
Well, thank you, Cassidy. It's been fun for me too.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.